Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com. Today we're in round 9 of our coverage of the 2017 US Chess Championships. Been a good one so far. Today's competitors, White's going to be played by Jeffery Xiong. He's a 16-year-old grandmaster. He actually won the 2016 US Closed Junior Championships. He's the highest rated player in the U.S. under the age of 18, and in the world, he's the second highest rated player under the age of 18. His rating is 2674, which is extremely high, only about 150 points lower than Wesley So, which is his opponent today. And Wesley's the second highest rated player in the world, although he is playing probably better than anyone, even Magnus Carlsen. He beat him in the last tournament they played. Wesley So is currently tied for the lead with Vadakobian, and so he's going to be looking to have a really strong performance with the black pieces today. We'll go ahead and get into it. Jeffery starts with pawn to d4. Knight f6, pawn c4, and then pawn e6 getting into the Kailan opening. Pawn g3 getting ready to fianchetto the bishop here to a g2 on the king side. Pawn down to d5, so this is the queen's gambit decline. Bishop to g2, and then bishop e7. And black kind of has two options, bishop to e7, castle on the king side, or the other option would be to go ahead and take this material right here. It's going to be difficult to hold on to this. A lot of times you just see queen to a4 right away, bishop to d7, queen takes here on c4. So more and more players are opting not to take this material here on c4 and just play it safe. Play bishop here to e7, knight to f3, castle on the king side, and castle over here. Would be interested to actually see if white takes here, so he doesn't have to worry about this pawn taking on c4 and then trying to get that material back later in the game. Pawn recaptures. Now he can castle on the king side if he wants to. Still has two central pawns. I think that's pretty good for white. But decides to go ahead and, after castle on the king side, castle his own way. And then after the pawn takes, queen up here to c2. He has a few options. He could play queen to a4. He could play knight to e5. All of these attacking this pawn. All these moves so far, though, the players are taking less than 10 seconds per move. So you can tell they're very familiar with the lines. They're comfortable. And so queen to c2 definitely seems like it was in Jeffery's preparation. Wesley So continues with pawn to a6, preparing himself to push forward with pawn to b5. White sees that, stops that right away with pawn to a4. Bishop to d7, just developing pieces slowly. Rook to d1. I think it makes sense also if he just wants to get that material back. Queen takes on c4. But first plays rook here to d1. Bishop d6, also has to be aware of the knight coming to e5, opening up the door for his light square bishop on g2 to attack this long diagonal. This pawn here on b7 would then be a weakness. So first plays bishop to c6, stopping that. Knight up to c3, bishop takes, bishop recaptures. Knight to c6, and then Jeffery decides to go ahead and give his double bishop pair up in exchange for these three pawns on the c file. So black's not going to be able to hold on to all these pawns. We've already talked about, white can get this material here on c4 when he wants to, but that's kind of what he's going for in this game, trying to have a better pawn structure going in towards the end game. Bishop to g5, completing his development, getting his dark square bishop involved into the game. Rook to b8, controlling the semi-open file that just opened up, and then pawn to e3. Up until this point, Jeffery's pretty much been taking less than 10 seconds every single move. E3 was the first time where he took about 20 minutes. So really trying to figure out how he wanted to continue on board, and decided to go ahead and solidify his pawn chain in the center of the board. Wesley decides now that since he has triple pawns on the c file, and it's going to be difficult for him to hold on to all this, he needs to use them to the best of his ability, and blowing up the center control that white has right now seems like a pretty good plan. So pawn to c5, after the exchange, the rook on d1 is now attacking the queen. Queen's forced to move. Comes here to e8, and then rook up to d4, allowing himself, if he wants to have a really strong attack on the king side of the board. He can also double barrel. He wants to prepare for the rook to come over here to d1, really control this central file with his rooks, and then knight up here to d7. Did have the option, if you look and say, let's go ahead and take that pawn, but it does get a little tricky with rook over here to h4. Bishop can exchange, but then this queen also is attacking the square here on h7. So pawn to h6, forcing the bishop to move. Bishop takes. We could see an exchange on board. Knight to e4 just gets a little tricky, attacking both the bishop and the pawn here on f6. We see queen e7, really the only option for black. It does defend both of these critical squares. But then queen up here to c3, preparing now for knight takes on f6, just blowing up the king side of the board. pawn e5, and then queen up here taking on c4. Black is just really in a tough spot right now, and has to worry about so many attacks on the king side of the board. So he decides to go ahead and play knight to d7, and then we see an exchange of bishops come off the board on e7, and then pawn up here to c6. So Jeffery doing a good job of pushing, putting a lot of pressure on Wesley So, even though he doesn't have a lot of protection on this pawn, decides he wants to push that as much as possible. So the knight comes back here to e5, attacking the pawn. And then we see queen up here to e4, protecting this pawn here on c6. And both sides, you'll start to see consolidate in the center of the board and see if either person can make a mistake. Queen down here to c5, knight up here to d5. Has the option of just taking, recapturing. I guess he looked at it and said, I'm not sure that's the best variation for me. Decided to go ahead and play knight down here to d3, and then knight up here to c7. It starts to get a little crazy from here. As far as how black can continue, he could either take with his rook down here on b2. Probably makes the most logical sense. You always want to get your rooks down to the second rank. You can just put a lot of pressure on your opponent. But from here, it's pretty straightforward as far as what white is going to do. He's either just going to maybe take here on c4, attack this queen, or he's going to play rook over here to f1. Those are really his only options. I really like Wesley So because he played knight to f2, and this gives white more options, some of which are really, really bad. Because the best play for white right now is to go with a little different exchange, not to take this knight here on f2, but to go ahead and say, okay, I take here on a6, and then you're going to take my queen, I'm going to take your queen. You're going to take my knights. I'm going to swing over here, take the pawn here on c4. You're going to have a minor piece, but I'm going to have these 3 passed pawns, and I'm going to try to push those up the board. At the end of the day, I think Jeffery has a pretty good game here. This knight's going to have a tough time stopping all of these passed pawns. He can't be super aggressive. He has to play pretty defensive in this spot. But if we come back to it after the knight comes down to f2, Jeffery decides to go ahead and take it with his king, and that's dangerous because the rook coming down here to b2 check, and then after king to f1, then queen over here to h5, just putting a lot of pressure, getting ready to come down to e2. That would be a quick checkmate on board. So now, Jeffery's forced to just play completely defensive, where we had a very, very aggressive line if he had just taken the knight here, the pawn on a6. So white continues with queen to g4, trying to exchange, but that's not what this game is about. Queen taking down on h2, threatening mate, just queen to f2 would be mate. The really only way to stop that is queen down here to f3. And then, wow, okay, there's a passed pawn, so starting to push in this forward. Pawn here to c3. Rook over here to c1, has to stop it as much as possible. Pawn to e5, attacking the rook over here to h4. And this is probably another one of those mistakes where rook to c4 makes a lot of sense. This passed pawn is very dangerous, and you want both of your rooks to attack that. What you don't want is to get your rook completely on the opposite side of the board, because as soon as the rook comes over here, this queen can move, the rook can come over here to d8, control this file now, and there's just too much pressure on the queen side of the board from these 2 rooks and this pawn, because after rook to h4, queen over here to d2, and now this rook is kind of completely out of the equation, which is not what white is looking for right now. Rook to d1, and then rook over here to d8, and so this is kind of tough. He can't just take it here on d2, because then rook down to d2, getting ready to push forward with pawn to c2 at some point. He's threatening just mate right away. Rook down to b1 would essentially threaten the queen to just come off the board, and then it'd be mate. So king to g1 is kind of a forced move. Rook down to b1, and then the queen's going to fall, and then rook to d1. King can come here to e2, that's fine, but then pawn c2, it's going to promote to a queen, and white's definitely going to fall here. So we see that white can't take that queen right here. Decides to go and play knight to d5. He does have protection from this queen, but unfortunately for him, it doesn't protect as much as he would like. It's actually going to be a free rook or a free knight here on d5, because if he were to take, let's say queen takes here on d5, well, then it's just checkmate. Okay, well, that's kind of a bummer. What if instead we take the queen here on d2? Well, now the rook takes, and we're kind of in that same situation as before. Rook threatening to come to b1, and there's no way to really stop the queen from falling, and then to even push this pawn down here to c1 for a queen. So after the rook takes, the knight on d5, then rook over here to d4. And this is kind of, I like this effort because it says, hey, if you take correctly, you know, you're probably going to win. But if you take incorrectly, let's say that this pawn here on e5 takes this rook. Okay, well, now it's very dangerous because pawn to c7 is threatening a mate, because pawn c8 check with the queen, the rook's forced to come over here, and then we have a back rank mate. And so black now has to worry about that threat. He could play pawn to g6, opening up the door for his king and escape path. Then pawn up to c8 check, and then king to g7. But now the queen's going to fall, and then, you know, pawn takes on d2, getting ready to push. But then queen down here to d1, stopping that. 2 queens versus 2 rooks. White's going to win this every single day. If we come back and say, pawn doesn't come here to g6, maybe queen over here to f2. Really the only other option that he has, even though none of these options are good in this situation. The queen takes, black rook comes over here, but then the king takes. Rook here to c5, threatening this pawn, which is fine. But then rook over here to d4, and the rook can't take on c7 because it just would be checkmate on the back rank. And so this is kind of tough. King here to f8 has to kind of stop the push. Rook up here to d8, king e7, and then let's just go ahead and get that queen. You're going to have to give me your rook, and then at the end game, white's going to have a pretty easy game. Now, fortunately for Wesley So, he decided correctly to go ahead and just take with his rook. And then after the pawn takes, then the queen takes here on d1. And in this position, Jeffery decided to go ahead and resign. There's no way for him to really get out of this. If the king or the queen were to come down here to d1, then just pawn to c2, it just kind of gets out of hand from here. He's going to push forward. There's no way to really stop this. He could play rook down to b1, depending on where he goes. So all in all, congratulations to Wesley So. With the black pieces tied for first place, comes in, gets a victory he needed. Now, the person he's tied with, Vardakobian, also won today, so we do have kind of a tight race at the top of the U.S. Championships. But all in all, exciting match, especially seeing such a young player play really well. You know, I thought there was one move where he could have tried something a little bit different, and I think he may have even had a better in-game with all those passed pawns on the queen side of the board. But one small mistake, and Wesley So took advantage. So congratulations to him. Thank you guys for watching round 9. We'll come back tomorrow for round 10.